Hello from the Key Culture podcast. This is Niilo Tarnanen, and I'm co-hosting this with Matei Gheorghiu.
Hello, everybody.
Today we're going to talk about elitism, and we have two really nice guests with us here, Libero Mureddu.
Hi, everybody.
Libero is an improviser, composer, and a doctorate student. And then we have Matthew Whittall. Hello, Matthew.
Hello, everyone.
And Matthew is composer, lecturer, and if we are to believe himself, a skilled home chef. Yeah, and why wouldn't we believe? So today we're about to discuss whether contemporary music is elitistic, and if it is, in which way it is. Of course, contemporary music is connected to the classical music at large. And of classical music, you can say that the history of it is very deeply connected to the history of the European elites. But is it so? Is it similarly when we speak of contemporary music? And is it even today that way of the classical music? There are really many ways to get into this. But from the demand of Matei, I will ask this from a really clickbait question, which is contemporary music elitist or not? And why? Maybe Matthew.
Okay, I was afraid you'd say that. Let's say that I'm going to take a politician's approach and not actually answer the question immediately, because I'm going to throw a wrench into the works here, because the first thought that came to my mind in hearing that question is how are we going to understand contemporary music or new music in this dialogue? Because I think that can mean a lot of different things. I mean, whether we're talking new music, capital N, capital M, as the sort of Central European kind of post-war modernist, however you'd like to define that particular culture of new music, or do we mean contemporary music more generally, as in any kind of music that's being written within the so-called classical tradition right now? And in one way, I would say, I think both. I mean, the short answer to the question is contemporary music or new music is both elitist and not elitist. It really depends on a lot of factors, including the culture that's hosting it, the culture that's creating it, the culture the composer comes from, the artist comes from. So sorry not to answer the question directly, but maybe we'll get there over the course of this discussion.
Yeah, I think you touched quite a good point by saying about that it's more about the subcultures inside of the contemporary music, maybe, than of if it's at large elitistic or not. Well, how it's for Libero? What would you say?
Quite similarly for Matthew. I mean, first of all, we should agree on what we define as contemporary music, first of all. And second, for me, it would be important also to understand whether with elitist or elitism, we are meaning here just the sort of the relationship with who pays, let's say, who is the elite, but also a sense of superiority quite often associated with the word elitism, of course. So where, you know, it takes almost an educational, if not a moral value somehow, a certain music that is proper and so on, and is the right thing to do and so on. So I would say probably, maybe, this is my answer, but first we should agree on what we are talking about.
I think there are really good points that you posed. I mean, the question of who pays, and the question of kind of who has the kind of ideal superiority in the eyes of somebody else, and who has the power. But also, I think these two questions of the definitions are actually really good. I think we will not get into any like definitions that will kind of make any further discussion unnecessary, where, you know, it would be impossible anyway. But let's say for the audience right now that we are not scholars on this particular question, but we are maybe speaking here from the point of view of four creators of music for whom, well, this question kind of arises because, well, we have to deal it if we create music, and we have to kind of think how it lands, what is its position in the culture we are living in. Please, Matei.
Yeah. So I would agree with both of you. However, I think it's also important to think how the public sees this, and my impression is that the public has the impression that contemporary music is elitist. Whether we're talking about, let's say, public who is the one of classical music, who connects much harder to contemporary music than to classical music, but also people who have nothing to do with classical music altogether. I think they just see it as some kind of artsy-fartsy like attempt to be snobbish without any kind of point. Now I'm just saying a very, very general impression of what I've heard from people. I'm not describing exactly what I think about it, but so we have to, I think, talk about who's paying and who's not paying, but also of how it is perceived from outside and not just from inside.
I think that's a third valuable perspective here, and I would personally say that even if we don't really agree with the kind of popular perception, maybe based on really, let's say, thin experience on the stuff itself, I would say it's still interesting to try to find out why people might perceive contemporary music from that perspective. Well, that said, let's spend maybe 2 minutes, 3 minutes, additional minutes trying to really define what is the contemporary music. I mean, you could really think it as the really large way that any music that is, made today. Or then we could think that some of the music that is, let's say, composed or otherwise produced today fits in it, and some other does not fit in it. So let's maybe discuss this a bit. What do you think of it? I would maybe personally state, and you may agree or disagree, that from a realistic point of view, not everything what is done today fits into the category of contemporary music. On the other hand, what kind of goes in and what goes out is a really fluid question. It's really hard to tackle it with some 3 bullet points of, who's insider and who's outsider. How do you think of it? Maybe Libero can start this time.
And nowadays I tend to consider contemporary music any music that is done in the present time. It has become more and more important to consider actually music making like that. One thing that you might not know, I have a fairly strong background also in pop music. In my 20s, for a few years, I worked both as a arranger, producer, keyboard player in various pop productions, from hip hop to maybe indie pop, indie rock with the majors, in advertisement. So I know also that side of the music making, which has become an even more is extremely specialized field nowadays, with a lot of subgenres and so on. So for me, contemporary music is that. But of course, I completely understand in the context of this discussion, contemporary music, we could say, I don't know, I might say that contemporary music, in particular the one that is under scrutiny here, is the music started by the Darmstadt school, let's say, after the war in Europe, and nowadays, let's say, generally speaking, taught in many universities, played in the so-called contemporary music festivals, both, of course, not only in Europe anymore. So if we want to focus on that, we can talk about that. Of course, there's a lot of other, let's say, art music, maybe that could be art contemporary music, but many of those, for example, those that originated in the United States, originated in a culture completely different than the European ones. Let's say in the counterculture, in the New York lofts and so on. So nothing to do with the situation in Europe, which was also extremely influenced by the war. We shouldn't forget that. Why a certain kind of music developed in a certain way was a lot of things connected with the post-war, also culture, certain philosophers, not only musicians, gave a certain importance to certain things that were important. Maybe a renewed sense of freedom for the composer, even this kind of pedagogical role that I guess might be the most problematic, and some people have taken as a sort of messianic maybe role for themselves in the world, to educate the masses to the real high art. I just want to say, no, I will say later. I stop here for now.
Okay, however you want. I need to say that this was actually a really illuminating point that you made about you had kind of two definitions, one really large of kind of any genre, any style that is done today, and one that is really kind of deeply rooted in the Darmstadt school and this kind of post Second World War, very academic kind of, let's say, this kind of ultra modernism that happened briefly after the Second World War. And let's see, these are two good definitions.
A third one, of course, the one developed in the United States.
Yeah, that was the third.
Yeah.
And maybe one question that I would need to kind of, if I want to personally kind of to say something about these three definitions, that let's say I'm not totally kind of happy to put myself to any of these three. All this said, I can say that I have much in common with all these three definitions, and this way I'm kind of happy that you took them as kind of at least three variations that we might see here. How about for Matt? What do you think?
Well, I'm just going to, without repeating what Libero said for his definitions, I'm just going to extend it a little bit. So if we understand contemporary music as, for the purposes of this discussion, as music that is created now and that is attached to the Western classical tradition, then I'm just going to define it as any music that's being made now. I'm not going to get into aesthetic schools, post-war modernism, European, North American. I think that any composer trained in who belongs to that Western classical tradition, however broadly or narrowly defined, is creating contemporary music. The question in my mind is whether something sounds contemporary. And that also has absolutely nothing to do with aesthetic. I think that a lot of contemporary neo-romanticism, very highly traditionalist contemporary music, the kind of things that you would find, for instance, in the North American wind band tradition or the North American choral tradition. A lot of that is kind of just as old-fashioned as a lot of modernist music that I hear. It's rooted in a kind of an aesthetic that it's no longer fresh. So, I mean, we're getting a little bit far off base, but that's how I define contemporary music, because of course I come from the North American tradition. I was born in Canada. I did most of my training before coming to Finland in the US. And I come out also of a performance background rather than specifically, I was an orchestral performance major long before I started to compose as a French horn player. So I come at it from a slightly different, much more mainstream outlook, which I think is to this day still quite dominant in North American new music. Is there is a greater attempt to integrate new creation into the mainstream concert practice outside of what I would describe as the kind of academic setting of the kind of New York, Columbia University, uptown modernist school that is, and that is very deeply connected to the European modernist tradition. So it's almost in a way a separate line of evolution from the rest of North American contemporary music, I would say.
A very good addition. I think it's valuable to kind of just point out to the audience that both in Europe and in United States and in Canada probably also, I will not speculate of the other parts of the world right now for the moment in sake of simplicity, but there exists this kind of tendency of certain ways of composing that have been more central to the academic tradition, and some other traditions who have, let's say, flourished outside of the academic tradition, and they have influenced each other, but still there are quite big tensions between them. And what kind of tensions? It, of course, depends on the country and probably the generation we're speaking of. But okay, Matei probably had something to add here.
I wanted to say that when I hear these discussions about what is contemporary music and not, and what belongs and what not, I always hear every composer describing things pretty much in the way you guys have done it, that, you know, every style belongs, every music that is done, and then it gets very philosophical about what it means to be contemporary music. But in practice, things are, I would say, pretty clearly defined. If you're going to apply for a grant with a project that does not seem as contemporary music, you're probably not going to get a grant. If you're going to be commissioned by an orchestra with music that does not sound as contemporary music, you're gonna find it harder to get it. And when I'm saying contemporary music, I don't mean necessarily only avant-garde dissonant music, but it has to sound like it's modern somehow. And I would say the choices that are made at entrance exams at schools for composition, at the commission level by ensembles and orchestras, and at the financial side with grants, for example, in the end, they define a lot what contemporary music means.
This is a good point that you proposed about the grant donors being, at least in a society like Finland, one important place of power, which for its own part kind of defines what kind of belongs into contemporary music and what doesn't. I would just say, from my own very tiny but still some experience in being in a jury that decides on grants, I would say that it's still not that simple as you might think. There are always some situations where you start discussing about, is this contemporary music, or kind of, you don't maybe put it in this word, but as you said it, Matei, it's basically about that. I would just have been maybe pointing out that you said that somebody maybe doesn't get an orchestral commission if it doesn't sound contemporary music. Maybe I'm a badass here to say it. Maybe it would be the opposite way, that maybe if you get better orchestral commissions if your music sounds a bit more old-fashioned. Well, you can take that.
Well, good luck with that.
Well, exactly, good luck with, because I haven't really seen the most experimental composers getting any commissions by orchestras, and I acknowledge it, because as a bassoonist who never made it to the professional level because I wanted to focus more on composing, but still played enough in amateur orchestras. I see that orchestras per se is a kind of, let's say, it's a big ship that turns slowly, so you can't do the most experimental stuff there. But okay, there, as seen, perhaps the audience has grasped that there are many kind of internal battles and twists in this question, and I hope we have now kind of turned up this dirty ground to the extent that we can maybe start going forward. Okay, maybe Matei, you could take the next session.
How about you guys? Do you consider yourselves to be elitist creators yourselves? And yes or no, then why? How about Matthew?
Well, I'm going to answer straight for once and say no, I don't. I mean, I can't deny that I am elite at this point. I have a doctorate from a major institution. I teach at that institution now, and I've studied in this very long tradition. I really consider myself part of that classical tradition. But as I don't think I'm elitist in that sense. I would probably consider myself more on the populist side. Even when my music veers into some forms of experimentalism, I really want to welcome the audience into what I do. I want them to understand. I want them to feel engaged. And in an interview at a festival last year, I made this comparison where I feel like the audiences in most cases are paying to be imprisoned with my piece for a given length of time, and I want that time to be well spent, even if it's a very intense one, even if it's a difficult experience. I want them to feel like they were welcome, like they had a stake in it. And so, yes, in that sense, no, I would not describe myself as elitist. I'm very much a populist.
How about Libero?
It's not an easy question to ask. If I think about the fields of music where nowadays I'm active into, so say experimental improvisation and as an intendant contemporary music, my attitude is definitely not elitist in both things. I want absolutely the audience to enjoy, to be there, to be present. In improvisation, the audience is a fundamental element. So whether the music I do is highly experimental or not, the connection with the audience is just part of the thing. And also when choosing music, I mean, I played, noise artist Merzbow years ago. I played Mika Vainio before there was any homage to this fabulous artist. But I'm completely myself of the opinion that a lot of especially when it comes to contemporary music, free improvisation is really still maybe an underground scene in many places. I work in a field that has some elitism in it, in the culture, in many of its participants, in the fact that anyway is a minority.
What field is that, so that our audience knows what you mean?
Well, the field of, let's say, the typical European contemporary music, post-avant-garde, post-Darmstadt, and so on. It's a very small scene in a way, in the big scale of things. So, and there is a sort of maybe elitism. I don't really know if it's if it's really elitistic, or is more this kind of a small scene that tells itself that we are the best, to sort of give each other some sort of like, yeah, you are good, you are cool.
It's more exclusive than elitist, I would say.
Maybe, yeah,
maybe
exactly,
the word you're looking for.
Exactly, like a club, a very special club, let's say, that, yeah.
I think you pointed out a good point, kind of maybe distinction. Like, I think that elitism actually means that you are not only in an elite position, but you try to defend that elite position and maybe make it stronger. And in this sense, at least, I wouldn't identify as an elitist, or I would actually identify myself as an anti-elitist. But then, on the other hand, this kind of exclusivity is another, I think, interesting discussion. Yeah, I just wanted to say this, but go forward where you were going.
No, I was exactly there. I mean, exclusivity is probably a much better word than elitism. I don't feel, let's say, I don't even feel a part of an elite. But of course, if I look myself from outside, where I live, what I do, I'm also anyway part of an elite in some way.
And I think every genre is going to have an elite. It's going to have a code of conduct. It's going to have ways of belonging and ways of deciding who is in and who is out. Whether it's the choral tradition in North America, specifically the U.S. that I mentioned earlier, is an extremely elite pursuit, even if it's a very traditionalist one. There are certain things that are perceived as being valuable in that tradition, and everything else gets left outside. And it's a very populist, highly accessible, and very traditionalist school of composition for the most part. So in that sense, even if the music itself is not particularly contemporary sounding in a lot of cases, it's still a very elitist pursuit to try and join that scene.
Well, let's ask you an unfair question. Since you come from North America, would you consider that the scene in Europe thinks of itself as being elitist?
As compared to North America?
As compared to North America.
Yes, definitely. I do tend to think that North American ideas are looked down upon in Europe. I mean, I'm old enough to say that at this point, and I've had enough experience as a North American composer working in Europe. to have been looked down on as a more populist composer. So I would say that, yeah, I think rather than viewing the North American tradition as something that branched off from the European tradition, but acquired its own set of values and its own points of emphasis and focus, aesthetically, culturally, I think it's still viewed as a sort of poor copy of the European tradition, whereas the European tradition is held in very high esteem in North America, to the point where it obscures the North American native creation to a very great extent.
So are we in the end talking more about the European elitism rather than something else?
In a certain sense, yes, but again, it depends on where on which part of the North American scene you were looking at. The orchestral scene, which is the one I work in most in North America, when I go back on the rare occasions I go back over there for work, is a very elite pursuit, and it's very much obsessed with the European canon of masterworks and of great composers, and so in that sense, yes, it's a sort of elitist and highly exclusive layer of classical music making. Other pursuits within classical music in North America are maybe more populist, more accessible, more rooted in community, like the choir, like the wind band tradition. So
I would like to ask a further question about the accessibility. So are you referring to the accessibility in terms of, for example, what do the tickets pay, or kind of how easy it is to kind of just come in and join, or do you refer to accessibility as of how easy it is to grasp the surface of the music, even if you haven't heard that particular type of music before, or both?
Both, I would say. I think, especially within the classical mainstream in North America, the accessibility in terms of the physical accessibility, financial accessibility of the events is not quite where it is in Europe, simply because orchestras, chamber music festivals over there, by and large, do not benefit from the same high level of public funding. So there a high level of subsidy that enables ticket prices to stay very low. Many orchestras have made commendable efforts, and festivals have made commendable efforts at lowering ticket prices in order to stimulate interest and to make themselves reachable by audiences who might not necessarily consider classical music to be an accessible medium, an accessible genre to them. But still, by and large, it sort of remains in a little bit of a bubble, I think, despite the fact that many more high-profile schools exist in North America to perpetuate that tradition. It's a bit of a quandary, I think, that classical music finds itself in North America.
On the other hand, sounds similar, and on the other hand, doesn't sound similar than what it is in Finland. I mean that even despite that, for example, the orchestras have a very big, let's say, percentage of state subsidies. How do you really subsidies? I've probably
this is going to the final cut.
Yeah, I've probably seen that word like a million times, but I maybe never heard it alive. So now I heard subsidies. Yeah, so even despite of the Finnish orchestra having a lot of state subsidies, they still have this kind of, let's say, a public kind of stamp on their what is this, forehead, that if you're gonna go to an orchestra concert, that's something elitist, even if actually, well, and maybe because of that image to some extent it is, even if it's in this let's say, if you just consider the prices of the tickets or something like that, it is actually relatively accessible. It's as accessible as going to a movie theater. This said, I would like to actually ask a bit more from both of you of the geographical variation in what you see in this situation of, let's not say if the contemporary music is elitist or not, but let's say what types of contemporary music are elitist in which countries, and why, kind of where is the power lying. Libero, you're from from Milan, and then you have also lived in Finland for a long time, but also worked in other parts of Europe.
Yeah.
So how would you say about this geographical variation question?
I just would like to say, before answering to this, I know it's quite annoying when people do that, but I would do what Matei said before about the audience, the element of audience. For me, and not for me, for many people, already a concert hall and an orchestral concert, let's say only of Beethoven music, is an elitist setting, is a place that many people don't step in because they have the feeling that it's not for them. That's something very common. I would say probably all around Europe. I'm sure various orchestras and concert halls, they have done some studies to understand how to get, especially the younger audience. So also, I just would like to extend that maybe this old tradition has become something that interests a fairly small part of the population who listens to music. But when it comes to elitism and maybe this question of accessibility, I can definitely say that for a while in Italy, but I'm sure the same was in Germany and in France, let's say that accessible was not such a good word maybe when related to music making. Then maybe the reasons behind are very big and very broad, and that would be interesting. And I'm not really prepared to discuss them in detail, but something going from finally the composer has the freedom to write whatever he or she wants. Finally there's not anymore the need of following let's say the needs of the opera tradition that in Italy was huge, but also in France. And finally a composer can write whatever he or she imagines, however complex or weird or strange it might be. So this is for me the good side. It's actually what attracted me to contemporary music originally, because it was so weird, strange, brave, complex. Any aspect was sort of scrutinized, analyzed, complexified. The music, the resulting music was absolutely nothing I've heard before. And that's a part that I always enjoyed myself. If that process have put a lot of audience aside, yes, of course. I mean, I don't know how other composers feel, but I have to be honest, I never hoped that, masses, if we can use this word, would be interested in listening my most experimental stuff. Because why? I mean, there are all the aspects of the sound, the resulting sounds are extremely complex, and sometimes they might go against the expectations of the listener on purpose. Or I might be interested in developing something that I don't know myself even if it's going to work, if I'm going to use it in the future. Something that, why not? Let's try to do it. Let's see what happens if I do something absolutely crazy but some artists, I had this experience having the feeling that oh, come on, if only the radio would play, let's say, Boulez and Stockhausen, the mainstream radio, then all the world would enjoy this music. I find this a bit unrealistic to use a kind of
well, if you put Boulez and Stockhausen.
Well, whatever, any contemporary music, but is the mentality behind that.
If they put my music, I'm sure the results would be different.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Yes,
yeah.
That's for me one thing. So I'm not surprised, but then at the same time, it's a bit in the nature. If one does a certain kind of art form, of course, it's not gonna be loved by the masses unless there is a cultural, let's say, machine behind a bit of what happened in contemporary visual art in some cases that creates a certain phenomenon which is related, of course, with the market and blah, blah, blah. And then this might reach enormous bits of audience or masses. Just as a side note, a group of British improvisers in the 70s refused this kind of music completely. So a kind of improvisation that sounds, let's say, fairly close to contemporary music, with a lot of experimentation in the materials, in the instrumental techniques. They refused it because they wanted to be close to the masses, and many of them, some of them, turn into Marxist or even better Maoist ideals, and they completely abandoned this kind of music to write, let's say, songs that workers could sing after work. Well, Nono maybe was hoping that the workers of the Fiat, the car factory in Italy, after 8 or 10 hours of work, would enjoy listening La Fabbrica Illuminata, and all of a sudden have a revelation about their life and their role as a proletariat. I don't know. I think, yeah, there has been a bit. I'm a bit. I don't know. I find it funny when some people would think that the masses would enjoy experimental music, but that's only me.
I think if I could just make a summary,
Please do it.
It seems that Libero's attitude is kind of the extreme opposite of what Matt described being the choral music elite attitude in Northern America, meaning that the choral tradition there, or let's say the elite choral tradition, wants to be accessible in the content, but on the other hand, it's really elitistic in kind of, let's say, in the productional processes. And on the other hand, kind of the way of musical creation that Libero is here describing as his own, in contrast to some other types, is kind of okay with the idea that, okay, this might be hard, and because of this, a bit exclusive to somebody. But on the other hand, is strongly opposed to this kind of institutional elitism that somebody would be kind of, let's say, that you would need to just kind of please somebody in order to become famous or become rich or become important. Well, I hope I get it right.
If I can extend Libero's point just briefly, because I think I love the perspective he's coming from about freedom, the freedom to do what you want, and I think that that's highly desirable in any genre of contemporary music. I think where elitism comes in is when we start imposing codes of conduct and cliques within an artistic genre, and what I described in the North American choral scene is one way of doing that closes off anything but a very conservative, very narrow view of what contemporary choral music is. And similarly in the European new music tradition, I think that there's a similar degree of exclusivity where it's, yes, the composer is finally free to do all of this crazy stuff, but it's not viewed as contemporary music unless it conforms to that code of doing crazy stuff. So you are free as long as you conform. And I think that's the thing that I rail against the most, is how we impose elitist codes of conduct across genres instead of being open to the possibility that we should be doing many different kinds of music, and that composers themselves can go back and forth between conservative and experimental with freedom and still be understood and still have their work welcomed. So I think that's where I locate elitism, is in the imposition of codes of conduct on creators. And as a composer who's kind of always felt neither traditionalist enough to be mainstream nor experimentalist enough to be in the the European new music tradition, it's that's where I position myself, is I would like a place for people who refuse to conform to any camp, and to preserve that essential freedom to just write whatever they hear, whether it's traditional or not.
I completely agree.
If I can also answer this, because you asked Niilo that all of us come from different European perspectives, and I come from another one. So in Romania, I would say contemporary music it's really not important to the public at all. I would say, compared to Finland at least, which is the other country where I've lived in, orchestra programs are very similar from season to season. you know that you're going to hear Tchaikovsky violin concerto played by one of the two orchestras in Bucharest every season. And you know you're going to hear Brahms fourth and Mahler first and like, and so on. And they pretty much roll the same pieces. And if there happens to be a contemporary music piece, it is always the first one, and it's always not longer than 10 minutes. Just to make sure that, you know, people don't leave. And before the revolution in '89, I know there was a time when composers were getting a lot of money to write all sorts of patriotic kind of music. And there were some composers who were doing pretty well thanks to this. But I think that's where some kind of rupture with the public also happened, because that music had some kind of communist background, but in the same time had the dissonance and let's say a more modern sound, and those pieces also tended to be longer. So very often, if that happened to be in the second half, people just left, you know, or people only came to the symphony but didn't come to the first half, and that kind of feeling has remained. Like, oh, it's that piece, okay. So we came for the Mendelssohn and the Beethoven, but this other piece, we don't care about that. And I think that has remained at least until the day when I left Romania. And there are some contemporary music festivals. There's the Contemporary Music Week in the end of May every year, where there are a couple of orchestra concerts, but also chamber concerts with contemporary music, but the halls are pretty empty. At least when I was there, they were pretty empty. And it's pretty much a vicious circle, because if you don't have public, then you don't really try to do your best. And these orchestras, I would say, play often really badly the modern pieces they have to play, because they know that the public don't like them. And then the public doesn't like them because also how the orchestra is playing them. And then the composers tend to be happy with whatever they get, because they don't get anything anyway. So in that sense, I would say in Finland, the fact that in a Musica Nova concert you can hear Boulet's piece in the first half and the Takemitsu and I don't know, pick your Lachenmann piece in the second half, it's with a full house almost. That's pretty unthinkable in Romanian standards. So I think history has a lot to do with this, and the way you have taught the public to behave towards the contemporary music. And this connects a bit to what Libero said earlier, with if you would put Stockhausen and Boulez at the radio every day, people would like it. I don't think they will like it, but I think that if you do put it a bit, and you know how to do it, and you know how to package it, and you know how to explain it, a bit will stick, you know? And I don't think we do that enough. At least in Romania, we definitely don't do. And this is another thing. Sorry, I keep talking a bit longer now. There's a certain way of talking in Romanian musicology, a very, very elitist way of explaining music. I can't even do it in English, I think. But always these kind of very precious words to explain music. And composers tend to want to use that because they want to seem like they're, you know, deep. And I think that's further a big disconnection to the public. If your music sounds very difficult and you're explaining it in ways in which nobody can understand what you're saying, that will create even further division from the public. And as I said, it's of course how it sounds, but it's also how you present the product.
Well, what you're describing, Matei, actually sounds, well, your initial thing of the piece no longer than 10 minutes. I just have to tell this anecdote because the scene you're describing in Romania reminds me a lot of stories I heard about Canada in the 1960s. And there actually is a very famous orchestra piece by the Canadian composer Murray Schafer, who was one of the first figures to sort of strike out and be a composer, to live the life of a composer, of an artistic creator in music in Canada. And he wrote an orchestra piece that's actually called No Longer Than 10 Minutes. Because it was required as part of the contract for the commission from the Toronto Symphony at the time. I believe it was the Toronto Symphony. And so that culture existed, but it did change very quickly in the late 20th century as contemporary music was sort of drawn more into the mainstream. But what you say about packaging, I think, is a point that that twigged something I was thinking about earlier, is that I think you can sell an audience to almost anything if you do it right. I've seen an audience be drawn into the most unlikely things, like Magnus Lindberg's Kraft, this gigantic violent orchestra piece. And every time I've heard it performed, granted this is only in Finland, but I've also heard tell of other performances abroad in North America, the audience just erupts to their feet, because it's a very visceral, powerful experience. And I think that people respond to that, no matter how difficult the music may be on the surface. And so I've seen audiences drawn into very strange things, but it's put to them in a way that makes the event make sense. It's not presented to them as something that should be off-putting. And if the idea of the music is carefully selected, then it's built to draw an audience in by doing something odd and unexpected, then pretty much I think it loses that, it shakes off that elitist specter, because then the audience is sucked in, they're present, they're part of the experience.
I guess the audience feels when you're honest. I mean, like when something's presented, you know, for its own sake, in a package that's kind of real, instead of being something, you know, bullshit. And I guess this is where Libero really touched the point by saying that we should be skeptical, if I got it right, that we should be skeptical about the big masses getting loving Boulez if we just make them listen it every day. Because no, I won't think so. So maybe better idea is not to try them to like it, but, you know, give possibility to those who might like it, and also give possibility to those who would, you know, would love Reich, or who would like something completely different. Maybe this kind of monolithic idea of one truth is what is for me the most disgusting thing in what Matei just kind of explained about the Romania of his childhood.
Can I say one more thing about so one other thing that I forgot to mention is that also clapping is very different in Romania than in Finland. Whenever a soloist comes, the audience claps really many times until they must give an encore, which I have not seen in Finland. In Finland, you know that they're going to clap 2 or 3 times and that's it. No matter if it's, I don't know, Sviatoslav Richter or like some local hero. It's all the same. And very often I've heard, very rarely I've heard an encore in Helsinki. But you know that after that no more than 10 minutes contemporary piece, the clapping is going to be very like this, and it's going to be once. And when the composer goes on stage, and then when he or she leaves, then the clapping stops. So there's a complete attitude built into this, like, yeah, this is that bitter pill that we have to like take every once in a while, and well, whatever. Whereas I have never gotten this feeling here, for example.
Maybe it's because here everybody's just too polite, and just for even the most depressing performance they have heard in their all life, they will, in being polite, clap approximately only a little bit less than you would normally do.
And about packaging, I was once in Canada, and I remember I went to a contemporary music concert by, I think the ensemble was called ECM Plus, something like that. Maybe Matthew knows it better. It was in Montreal. And they had also a lot of money to do this, but I remember that the hall was full, was like some 300-400 seats, and it was full, was many young people. And I would say the music itself was not even that great for my taste, but there was a presenter who looked like a talk show host, who was like, "Hey, everybody, nice to see you, and we have today this composer and that composer." It was kind of like a late night show, and then the composer went on stage and they presented their works, and it was like a very fun atmosphere. And I thought at that point, now you could put anything, you know, it's still gonna sell to some extent, just because of how they presented the whole thing. So that is something that I think we should improve if we want to connect to people somehow. Because if you're gonna make it boring and like you're just here to listen to the music and nothing else, I don't know if we're going to be that successful in the long run.
Yep.
Libero has a point, I think.
Yeah, Libero has a point. Yeah, and then
Yeah,
I have a question.
want to
But
say
first,
that
Libero's point.
With the contemporary ensemble of the Academy, we have performed now, was it 5 times at the Flow Festival, and this has been a very, very revelatory experience because somehow there was not any flashy presentation or anything. Actually, there was no presentation whatsoever, except that while we're doing some stage changes, we had a couple of occasion people presenting. We had Tim Furchon once and Andrew Bentley. So they told stories about the music we performed. But what I always find interesting is that the festival itself has created an impression of themselves, which is quite real also, as a place where people, usually young people, go to see what's new. It's almost like, you know, a cool radio back in the days, or a cool record shop that has all the new things in a way. Of course, some very famous, because those are needed to attract big groups, but also a lot of really, really odd stuff. And we have performed there from Romitelli to Cage on the more, let's say, complex or less accessible side, to Reich, which actually it wasn't accessible at all, very early Reich, to Philip Glass. And I've seen always people being completely interested, big numbers, about, you know, maybe 1,000 of people in some cases there listening, without any presentation, without any comment. This is it. And it was very interesting. I mean, it's a very smart thing they have done to put themselves in a way as the distributor of interesting stuff.
But in that case, it was the festival that had created the package that allowed you to not have to say anything else than what you were presenting.
Absolutely. I'm recognizing in that their how smart they have been, but also how brave they have been in actually calling not only the Ensemble of the Academy, but the Fun Ensemble, other groups that are active in the contemporary music scene, and putting them at the same level, let's say, in the program as the other acts. You know, it's not like, and then in the last page, a very small here, some contemporary music offer. But, you know, you would have Roisin Murphy and then Nyky Ensemble, the Fun Ensemble, Pet Shop Boys. You know, it's kind of interesting, I have to say. But as an example of something, as far as I know, I don't know any other similar experience. Maybe Matt, you know, something in the States,
well,
similar, or the others.
I mean, maybe not to that extent, but I do think that part of, I mean, since we're talking about this perceived elitism that's sort of embedded in the making of contemporary music, I think part of the problem is its tendency to ghettoize itself and to close itself off in these festivals that I think have the kind of specter of elitism floating around them, of something that's not for you. That might be a carryover from the post-war period when the music really was not for you. But I really do think that it's this tendency to want to isolate itself. And I think that tendency is maybe has good intentions, is to highlight its profile, to make it special, to make it a real event. And I think contemporary music festivals overall, they have a strong role to play, and they're valuable. But what I perceive as part of the problem is this lack of embedding contemporary music in everyday life as something that is seen as a normal and accepted pursuit in contemporary society. The composer as a community figure, not someone who descends from on high to present their works in a very elite situation. And I think in that sense, in Finland, we're very lucky, because by and large, I mean, you know, we're not raking in the bucks with the way we used to in terms of royalties. I don't think anyone is anymore, but I think by and large in Finnish culture, the creative artist as a member of the community, as a legitimate everyday, I don't know, lower middle class pursuit, is still widely accepted, and composers still have a strong role in the community in terms of how they They work with, in pedagogical situations, in schools, with amateur ensembles, within festivals. I mean, that wonderful festival system that Finland has, where all of the musical lifeblood just flows out of the cities and straight into the extremities of smaller locations in Finland in the summer. That carries contemporary music with it, and composers go with it, and they get to talk about their works, and people who might not otherwise get to hear their music get to hear their music. So I think that tendency of contemporary music to in the post-war period at least, to close itself off into this rarefied sphere of creation is a really big part of the problem. And now we come back to accessibility. But is your music out there where people can hear it? Are you visible? Do you make yourself part of the community? Are you framing yourself as a sort of public servant in a way, presenting people with your work to consider, or are you talking down to them as a creator? And I think just as an audience can spot fakery in the way we communicate, in the way our music communicates, they can also spot a mile away being condescended to.
Yeah. Matt,
Exactly.
just because our audience probably doesn't know everything about contemporary music, you kept saying like the post-World War life where music was closed and it wasn't for you. Why did that happen then? And is it still influencing us now?
Well, it's a very complicated question, isn't it? Why did that happen?
Because it did happen, but why?
It absolutely did happen. I think, well, part of it is what I view as the kind of the post-war period in many ways was the sort of apotheosis of the romantic artist ego, of the great creator, creating these masterpieces that are meant to enlighten us all. I think that kind of got blown a little out of proportion. And we have these, I think historically, these big cults of personality around post-war composers, around Boulez, around Stockhausen, any number of other figures, that were very much about the creator and their persona. So I think, I mean, I'm not explaining this very well. I mean, Libero is so much better at explaining this stuff from the European perspective in an accessible way. So maybe I should turn this over to him. But I think that is part of it. This sense that almost a church of persona, a church of artistic ego grew up that I think became very off-putting to audiences.
Libero.
No, not only. This will be really unfair. While of course there are people, and there's been people that definitely were or are like that, we shouldn't forget that the models, the role models for the post-war composers were composers who were considered immoral, who were completely underground composers, isolated from the public scene because of the music they were writing.
Absolutely.
Because of their race, because of their background. There's the famous, phrase, was it Adorno? Maybe, I don't know, and then I'm really ashamed of myself. After the concentration camps, one cannot write melodies. This is something that was present. Taking Webern as a model is like taking, back in the days, Schubert as a model, the biggest loser ever, in so many ways. Scale of work, I mean, there's 3 CDs of music. No one had maybe the late Boulez only had, Strauss and Mahler and Bruckner as examples in order to manage the long form. But at the beginning, really, it was sort of the revenge of those that were excluded before, excluded by a word that, maybe 50 years ago was still running with operettas and, say, mass music, mass classical music. And then what was a little bit of experimentation, maybe in the 20s in Paris and so on, and then the war sort of destroyed everything. Then again, there's a lot of money that after the war went to German radios. We shouldn't forget also, nowadays these things are starting to be discussed. Same in the States. Why all this support, let's say, for Cage, Merce Cunningham and so on, and in Europe for Darmstadt? For sure, there was money involved at some point.
There was, and just to add one point of this very good kind of explanation that I've read from some place that actually CIA
Yeah,
gave
exactly.
money to Darmstadt and some other initiatives in at least in West Germany after the in the beginning of the Cold War, because the threat of the communist regimes, and because I think this is kind of a bit having a line to what Matei described, because in many communist countries in Eastern Europe and in Central Europe that time, there was only one truth that was very populistic in one way. So what kind of music CIA wanted to promote was, of course, the music that was the totally opposite of that. So the music that was not tolerated in the Soviet countries. So this is interesting. It's kind of these kind of identity politics we see today just taking into a really mad levels that something is very good somewhere, and the very opposite of it is very good somewhere else. Maybe not any other good reason than just the reason of being opposite.
I just will add a very small thing that, free improvisation, for example, flourished in Germany, in Berlin in particular, still is an important capital, because of course in the 70s, basically any artist would get funding. It was very cheap, and West, of course, wanted to promote, like, hey, this is the land of freedom. Any artist can get anything. Do whatever you want. We had even David Bowie going to Berlin in those years and enjoying the creative atmosphere when he was working with Brian Eno. I'm aware of it. I know that in a way that scene also enjoyed the things that are bigger than us. So in a way, maybe what I wanted to reply to the point of Matthew is that composers at times have been definitely extremely powerful. Boulez, one name at least, from the mid 70s onward, but also quite often composers are just enjoying or not, or the opposite, the results of decisions that are done on another level. I mean, if I get money to do my crazy stuff, why shouldn't I just do it in a way?
Of course, and I'm really glad that you brought that up, because of course it illuminates my point, but I think it also brings us back to, I mean, Matei's question about about music, post-war music sort of closing itself off. And I think that what happened wasn't so much that the fault of any individual person or any small group of people, but was just, I think what happens in an attitude, but I think just what happens in terms of cycles of artistic creation over time, quite naturally, which is a sort of centripetal force that brings things that were at the extremes before towards the centers of power. And that kind of mitigates against diversity and against freedom. And so now we're back to freedom again. And I think that's in a way what happened, because if you looked at the early 20th century, or the turn of the century, in Europe, as well as in American music, I think there was this incredible diversity of style and approach that diverged along national lines mainly, but also diverged along lines of traditional versus experimental. If you think of the music of Varese and the music of Poulenc coexisting in the same time period. I think that incredible turn of the century diversity was in a way stamped out by the war and the kind of rise to prominence of that which had been excluded. That that kind of enforced sameness, I think, in a way contributed to the decline of influence of the music, paradoxically, because I think audiences were less and less sort of perhaps interested in hearing music that kind of all sounds the same. And I think that what's happening now is that we are re-encountering again that kind of turn of the century flourishing of multiple styles, that decentralization of aesthetic power. And I think that that's really wonderful. And that's what's going to bring audiences back to our work.
I hope so too. I hope that's happening. Well, we won't know what's gonna happen after this pandemic and many other things that are going around, but I totally agree that if we can light the spirit again with this kind of many really different kinds of stuff happening simultaneously, not only in different countries, but also in geographically quite in the same spaces, it's wonderful. It's wonderful because it's really dialogue between different ideas, and there must be something for everyone from that big box kind of.
And it always brings us back to what Libero said earlier, creative freedom, the ability of the composer to do whatever they hear without prejudice from their colleagues, without prejudice from the institutions that fund the creation of art, without prejudice from the audience. And I think that that is the most important thing. If we can preserve that freedom, if we can encourage that kind of freedom and that kind of openness, then we've got something. But then we're not elitist anymore.
Does it really exist? Because I have some doubts about that. Because I've always heard this, like, now you can do everything you want. So there is a feeling always that there's freedom, but you better guess what the right things are. And this is my impression a bit with contemporary music. Everyone wants you to do what you want, but you better fit the right profile so that you get promoted, or so in the end you start thinking what others think you should be doing. So you might try to fit in the right boxes.
Well, or then you just need to create your own box. I mean, yeah, but to some point, I think Matei has a point. I mean, that if the culture is very conforming, or let's say wants to have consensus about everything, which kind of is the norm in Finland, and then you have a limited number of elites that really give you the that have the facilities, that have the money. So then, of course, you will face this problem. Yeah, just to say kind of two contrasting things. But
well, I mean, just to kind of to put a slightly more hopeful spin on Matei's point, and I do agree that, yeah, I mean, freedom is really nice in principle, but we don't always have it. But I also don't think that freedom means lack of compromise on the creative end. I think that like I said, I think you can sell an audience, and I have seen an audience buy almost anything, believe almost anything if it's sold to them right. And I think from the creative end, that means that we can't take this totally uncompromising my way or the highway attitude, that the creation of art has to be an act of communication in many ways. It has to be a give and take. And you can, and this comes back to packaging, you can package some really radical ideas and have an audience eat it up. But that involves also reaching out to them in different ways, whether it's by toning down the edge on the idea, whether it's, as Libero pointed out, of having this fantastic hip festival sort of act as the package for your work, and then giving you the room to do whatever you want. There's compromise involved in that. And I think that part of the kind of ghettoization of contemporary music in the post-war period that's lasted up until now is due to that, a kind of uncompromising attitude of, this is my vision, take it or leave it, where the people commissioning the art, people consuming the art, are not really involved in the interaction, you know, and that's where the kind of romantic ego is off-putting for me.
Yeah, same here.
This kind of leads us into one question that I'm kind of intrigued to go next. We were talking about this kind of big ego idea that composers would be big, important figures that are then condensing to the audience. What I think that it comes quite a lot from the Romantic period, and from the idea of composers as some kind of geniuses. I would say it's a Romantic and modern idea of composer as a genius. So somebody who's kind of superior to normal mortal human beings. What's your personal relationship to this? Do you do anything to reach it in practical means?
First of all, okay, this definitely started in the early Romanticism, but it got then petrified in the late Romanticism. That's maybe an important point. It's a bit different, the attitude that, let's say, the early generation, Schumann, Chopin, and so on had, even Mendelssohn we can include, compared to this, sacrification. It sounds almost like a death metal band. I don't know if it exists. Sacrification of the composer, especially of the already dead composer and so on. It's something that is still with us, you know. Is the Beethoven thing that we have that has nothing to do with Beethoven, how Beethoven was active in his own life, how his music was perceived, is the idea of Beethoven that maybe is about started from, I don't know, 1860, 1870 to be really, really strongly there. Like you can't have a season without Beethoven, a music season, and so on. The early Romanticism was a very experimental period. We shouldn't forget that. I always like to separate those two phases. We have this idea of the composer, what's a demiurgo in English? You know, the one.
Demigod.
Okay, demigod, the one that creates everything from the beginning until the end, the universe and blah, blah, blah. I don't know, in my practice as an improviser, I'm actually facing the opposite problem. Who is the, let's say that we call what we do instant composition. So we are working on creating a form, a piece of music in real time. Who is composing it? I mean, my ensemble, we all create the music. I mean, I might propose, I'm the leader of my own group, so the one that sends all the emails, let's say, and pays the bills and the fees, I might frame the things in a certain way. But of course, there's an enormous care, and that's also actually part of my research. Where is the limit when working with an improviser to give to him or to her the maximum freedom possible, and at the same time frame the playing in a certain way that has nothing to do with the traditional composition, you know, as something to do with maybe suggesting. There's an interesting concept of what was enabling constraints versus forcing constraints. So quite often this is how I work with it. Enabling people to do things that maybe they wouldn't have thought. Try to, also for myself, to have things, it can be a software, an idea, maybe a fragment of score, but not really, that actually pushes us to do something unexpected. But that said, they are all creators, and of course, at the moment of dividing, you know, the copyright, I would find it extremely difficult to, for example, take everything on myself, because it is a specific framework. When it comes to the audience, you know, I don't really know if I now switch to my intendant role. When we started to have always a full house with the nuclear ensemble concerts, it was a few years ago. Now we had a little decline, but hopefully it will go back. I think there was a lot of activity on social media trying to include people very diverse. We were very lucky to get a couple of articles on a blog which is quite popular, not in contemporary music, but in, let's say, urban culture, maybe. That was very useful, having some students from Kuva and Teak, so from the Theatre Academy and Fine Arts Academy, coming regularly, because maybe we had some friends in common. And they were much, you know, that has brought some younger people. And of course, the age of the players, they are all very young players, they are students. So they bring their friends, and this create maybe this kind of, you know, that younger people come, and people that usually don't go to the concert halls. But I really think that, yeah, I would leave aside the compromise on the artistic point. That's a really freedom of the composer to do it. I really respect the composers that are very close to the audience and composers that are very far from the audience. Is the internal reasons I won't discuss them. Yeah, please, Matt, make sense of what I said. Save me from this.
At this point,
buddy.
At this point, I'm a little bit I'm not quite clear on what the question was anymore. But I think I mean, I guess the basic point is what do I do to kind of bridge that gap?
Yes, I would say, or let's say to if you want to kind of break the image that this kind of genius cult is somewhat relevant. So do you do anything to kind of, you know?
Yes, I do. I'm coming at this from a slightly different perspective because Libero and I have slightly different day jobs. We're both composers, music creators, but I come from the sort of heavily notated school as opposed to the improvised school, and my day job is teaching. So I'm thinking from this as a thinking about this from an educational point of view, and not in terms of what I want to force students to learn, because my early mentors as composers, they kind of just taught by example. Like I learned to be a composer by just seeing how composers lived and how they made music, rather than anybody kind of teaching me what to write or how. And the example that I got from some of my early mentors, Robert Jones, the late Robert Jones, who was a Canadian composer, who was a very important figure in my early education. David Maslanka, also, who passed away a couple of years ago, who was an American wind band composer, was a very important early mentor for me. And what I saw from them in terms of their work to bridge the gap were two things: were honesty, three things, let's say: honesty, community involvement, and mutual respect. And that mutual respect goes back and forth between the composer in not acting like a pretentious twat, and being humble and being accessible and speaking in a way that makes the music, that helps make the music accessible. And that mutual respect also extends to performers as well. I mean, I cannot stress enough to my students how important it is to be respectful towards the performers, but also to demand the same respect from them. They are not doing you a favor performing your music. They are your colleagues in all situations. And so they owe you the same respect that you pay to them. This is, and so this is an exchange of respect that I think is very important. And that helps make the music accessible to the performers, and then turn around and present it with joy and conviction to the audience. And another thing that I like to stress is really just putting yourself in the position of who is experiencing your music. Something I always stress to my students is put yourself in the position of the listener. Walk away from your work, and we have these wonderful this wonderful ability to play our own music back to us in most cases now. I mean, if you're using the notated kind, you have MIDI playback, computer playback. You can experience your music in real time without performing it yourself. And so my question is always, go back and listen to your work. Are you captivated? Are you convinced? Is this honest? Are you drawn into it? And if you're bored, why are you still writing it? Why are you still doing that idea? And I think that that's the kind of experience that transmits to the audience, because if we as creators are involved in what we're doing, whether it's improvised or whether it's fully notated, then I think that commitment transitions to the audience. I mean, when it comes to packaging and marketing and things like that, I'm the last person who should talk about this, because my twin roles are making the music and teaching it. So beyond that, I leave it to other people to promote it and to package it and sell it. But I think from the creative and educational point of view, those are the things that we can do.
I think these were really nice points. Matei, would you like to say something?
I could also say something about this. I think it's also the performers and the conductors who should be, let's say, responsible to try to bring to the audience always as best product as it's possible. And you would say that it's very obvious, but as I told you with the example in Romania, and it's not just Romania, it's the world is very, very full of badly paid contemporary music. If contemporary music would be played very well, then the audience have a better chance to understand the music and find a connection with it. I remember I talked to once with a composer from Colombia who was telling me, I actually asked him, like, how is it that always I meet a composer from Colombia or Argentina and they're all doing electronic music? And he was like, well, because they perform us like shit there. So we all turn to electronic music because we don't want to be butchered. And there is a truth to this. So it's also very much a responsibility of the performers to try to give a very good performance of the piece so that the audience can be very open to it. Did that make any sense?
I think all of you said things I would like to comment, but maybe I'll just, because we have already been here talking quite a long time, I will just maybe add a point of my own, which is perhaps a bit of continuum of what Matt was talking about of the mutual respect. I found out, I realized as I was younger and I was still doing my, let's say, bachelor's or master's studies, that the way I was kind of encouraged to compose, or let's say the way I perceived I was encouraged, I don't really know if this was the intention of my teachers, led me to compose in ways that made the performers actually be troubled about things I didn't want them to be troubled. I mean, like do my fingers go kind of fastly enough to places in a virtuoso manner enough, or you know, stuff like that. And let's say after that, when I realized, oh, I didn't want this to be hard, you know, I didn't want this to be tricky in a way that leads you thinking of oh, am I perfect, am I, you know, am I doing my best? But you know, because I would really like that the performers would be thinking the music more in a more creative way and in a more philosophical way when they perform it. So I have started, maybe, let's say, not always writing simple stuff, but I have tried to write my scores in a way that more and more the performers could focus on the questions of how, and the questions of quality, and questions of, you know, interaction between themselves, but also interaction with the audience, and you know, have less of the really side-eyed stress about, am I playing the right notes at the right time all the time? You know, that it's not the sheet music, but it's the musical experience. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I have really success in this, but let's see what will happen when I'm as old as the average of you other three guys.
Ooh, ouch.
Well, okay, I am
All
just
right.
joking. I'm the youngest here, who's probably making too big noise of myself.
It's all right.
So
Not at
Niilo,
all.
I completely agree with you. And in Milan, and in my experience, when I used to be a composer, let's say, it was pretty much the same. We were encouraged to write in a certain way. There was an intrinsic value in music written in a certain way. And I remember, I won't make any name, but certain composers who maybe turned in the middle of their career to a more accessible towards the musicians kind of music, they were heavily criticized in certain circles. Absolutely. I also remember having someone suggesting me to simplify certain things, and another person, quite famous composer, checking the score, was like, "Why you wrote it like that?" I say, "Yeah, to make it easy for the players." Like, come on. Of course, they will learn, they will study. You know, it's always, again, like finding, there are so many good arguments also for the opposite, that, you know, without the first note of Rite of Spring, a lot of music wouldn't have been written if someone wouldn't have tried back then to do something extremely risky. So it's always, I don't know, there are so many faces on it, but of course, yeah, there are so many ways one can look at it.
Well, yes, I mean, and just to sort of extend that point very briefly as the last thing, I think probably the atmosphere of the times encouraged that kind of, enabled that kind of experimentation, and enabled that kind of risk taking that, I mean, even the example of Stravinsky downsized and simplified in a very radical way after the First World War, because it was just necessary to do so, I think. Both economically and in terms of the prevailing aesthetics of the time. So it's impossible to separate the value of experimentation from the culture of the period. And but I think that it just comes back to honesty. Is a composer doing their work with honesty, and are they compromising enough to be able to get it across to the audience? Because as I said, even with compromise, it's possible to get off very radical, very difficult ideas, to get those through to the listener, to the people who are consuming your work. And it really is an act of consumption, both communication and consumption. So when we present our art with honesty and with a view towards who our audience is for a given event, a given project, a given piece, and that involves a little bit of compromise, then I think that the ground is really ripe to make an incredible connection that can break down that perceived wall of elitism.
I think it's a good. I think risks are needed, but the question is, why do I take this risk?
Exactly.
I mean,
is the context for the risk? Is the context for the risk there?
That's also, yeah. What's my goal, and what is the context? And if the risk is worth taking, if it's really worth taking here, or maybe if it's worth taking somewhere else.
Niilo, you said you wanted to do like one more comment or something?
Yes, I would just like. I was very enthusiastic of just letting everyone to say some small fragment in the end before we call it a day. Like, what's your outcome of this discussion, or what's your last tiny detail of agenda you want to go through before our common time ends?
Yeah, you have 3 minutes to think about it, and
I'll do it very quickly. Well, it was super fun and great to talk. Really nice conversation, nice questions, nice interaction, and my first podcast, so I'm super excited.
might not be your last.
Exactly. My last comment that I thought about it would be about this time of diversity that we are living in, that I'm extremely happy about, and maybe would be like institutions now, is the role of institutions, organizers, to make this happen. Let's say that not only the composers and the artists can carry the responsibility of it, because even if you do your own channel, your own publications, your own records, it's a lot of work. But of course, institutions come always a bit later to things. So I really hope that all the various institutions will understand that those are different times, and they will start to actually create the reality of this diverse world that we live in. That's my last comment. Thank you very much for.
I guess I would say, well, I had a great time too. It's such a pleasure to get to discuss this stuff, because I so rarely do anymore these days, especially with the global situation as it currently is. So conversation like this is always really enlightening. I guess just in closing, I would say that contemporary music is only as elite as we choose to make it. Both, I think, from the creator and presenter end, and also from the audience end. I think that we owe each other, like I said, mutual respect and understanding, and also a sense of openness, an attitude of openness towards things that we might not necessarily like. To take, I think there's a responsibility of risk taking that the audience needs to take on too, is just the risk of not liking something, and that our failure as audience members, our failure to like a piece of music, doesn't necessarily indicate anything about the piece itself, and maybe says more about us, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, and it's not something that we should take offense at when we dislike something. There's a lot of music I don't like, but I'm always willing to take the risk that I will. So I think breaking down the barriers of elitism goes both ways.
Very good point.
Very well said.
Matei.
Maybe for most important for me is to believe that there is going to be a future that I can look forward to, let's say, in contemporary music as a whole. I remember I talked once to an Austrian conductor, it was very many years ago, maybe 13 years ago, in Vienna, and he said something like, contemporary music is kind of like an experimental drugs factory. You create many pills, you test them, you want to see how to get the best pill for each patient, and you make 20 different pills, and then the 200, and then one is like the one that works, and that's why we should keep investing all the time in everybody's pieces, in everybody's voice, because you don't know what is going to be that one thing that will capture audiences and capture imagination. And the day people stop composing music will be the day when we say classical music ends here. So because there is this long tradition, and at that point when people will stop composing, and they will be the composer will stop being considered as being part of this tradition. About it we could say it started here and it ended here. And if we don't want that to happen, then we have to give also credit for composers for taking this music further down the line. So classical music shouldn't be seen as Mozart, Bach, Beethoven, and Rachmaninov and so on, and then we have this one piece every once in a while that is the no less than 10 minutes piece, no more than 10 minutes piece at the beginning, so that we can pretend we still have a tradition. I think we should believe in it, and we should be open to it, and it comes from all the angles, from composers, from performers, from conductors, from teachers, to understand that we are all in this together somehow, and we keep classical music going and modern music if we all understand its importance and its value.
Thanks, Matei. I would personally say that I'm okay for changing definitions. I'm okay for changing traditions, many things being quite vague and up to the ear, also in the ear. But what I don't really like, to say one thing in the end, is I don't like the word avant-garde for one reason. It says that you're on front of the troops, and that necessitates that you know where you are going to. But how do you know where are you going to? No, you don't. You just need to explore everything and see what comes out of it. I think this is my attitude towards the diversity and my attitude towards the experimentalism. You don't know what will work. You just need to try and give it maybe even a second or even 30th chance. Well, to this, I will end this episode with the elitist dictatorial powers of the moderator of this episode. And we have had a really nice discussion, which has touched really many important topics. At least I have enjoyed it, and if I properly heard what the other people said, also they enjoyed it. So, for my behalf, thank you for listening or watching this Key Culture podcast about the question if contemporary music is elitist or not. Thank you for our lovely guests, Libero Mureddu and Matthew Whittall.
Thank you. Goodbye.
And in the end, could you, Matei, tell the basic stuff about the click and clack and...
Yes, this is my favorite part. So everybody, please like, share, and subscribe. And click the bell icon for whatever. I don't really know how that goes. I always forget it. But yeah. Anyway, just click the notification button. Yes. Anyway.
Yep. Click us. Don't click the bank hoax people clicks. Okay. That said, have a nice day or evening or whatever time of day you're having.
All right.
Have a nice evening, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Cheers.
just some short comment if you
Wait,
have one. So
wait,
Matei.
I have a very strong comment. I'm really dying here. I need to go to the toilet. I'm sorry. Like I've been
Okay.
suffering for many minutes and waiting for
Oh.
you guys to stop so that I can
Okay.
finally say it.
So you go to the toilet.
Wait a
Okay.
minute.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. This is totally getting left in the final video, right? Right.
Yeah, after the credits. You know,
I guess not, but
Talk about elitism.
Can't believe
I
it.
was thinking all this time, like, when the fuck are they going to stop this bullshit with? Oh, but we take risks for this, and like, no, but I have to. I was like, I want to go now.